So, Danny, you're involved with the Transform Policy Foundation. Can you just explain exactly what your position is with them?
So I'm Head of Policy and Communications. I founded Transform about 12 years ago. And decided that I was a better speaker than I was a manager, so I demoted myself.
And what do Transform Policy Foundation do?
Transform exists to promote sustainable well-being by bringing about regulated drug markets, which is basically to say we're not just ideologues who want to see the position shifted for the sake of it, but we're here to make the world a better place by ending the global prohibition of drugs and enabling nation states to put in place legal systems of control and regulation.
So what do you think is actually wrong with the existing drugs policy that in the UK?
Quite simply, what we've done is we've taken what is ostensibly a health and social issue, and an issue of personal freedom in terms of what you put into your own body, and made it a criminal justice issue. And that is a foolish, misguided thing to do, as we learnt with alcohol prohibition between the 1920 and 1933 in the States. And we've created the same thing. But because the UK is committed to a global system of prohibition, what we've done is we've reinvented that for the 21st century on a global scale and created international mafias of startling proportions, filled up prisons way over and above what we should have done, gifted one of the largest trades on earth to organised crime. We've filled the coffers of paramilitaries, terrorists, non-state actors throughout the world, and basically enabled governments to pull the wool over the eyes of the electorate by pretending to be doing something good when they're actually doing something awful.
So your position is that you Transform want all drugs to be legalised completely?
All drugs, the question for us is which drugs do you want to leave in the hands of the Taliban, the FARC, right-wing paramilitaries, unregulated dealers and organised criminals? And the answer is none. We know that there is a significant level of demand out there for illicit drugs. Now, to the extent that we can't stop that level of demand, both for people who recreationally use and people who use on a dependent basis, the only thing you can do is take control of the supply, because otherwise all you do is you gift the trade to the kind of people who you wouldn't want to be in control. But also you give up democratic control. You give up any chance of influencing the quality control of production, the way that these things are supplied, who gets to use them, how old they are, what price they are, any of that. You give up all of that. So it's a no-brainer. So rather than asking which drugs should be legalised and why you support legalisation, I would ask anyone why on earth they support prohibition on the basis of the fact that it only causes bad things to happen.
The fact is, though, that in the UK, it's very difficult to find politicians, or many politicians, who would actually seriously talk about legalising of drugs. So how do you advocate trying to tackle that problem? From my perspective, I do know that there are numerous politicians who in private understand and agree that the current situation isn't working regarding drugs, but in public they won't say that, and they either dodge the question or they even say things that actually maybe they don't really think about the existing system. So how do you advocate trying to tackle that problem?
Well, the first thing is what's brought that about. Now, you have a political system that invites people in, encourages people in on the basis that they support primarily a political orthodoxy. And there's been an orthodoxy around prohibition that's lasted many decades now. So it's difficult to operate in that environment if you hold non-orthodox ideas. So it's partly to do with the self-selection process, where you're unlikely to find yourself as a Member of Parliament, for instance, within that orthodoxy. The other thing is that politicians have also created a rod for their own backs by running an ongoing propaganda campaign that suggests that these things are the spawn of the devil. They do talk about drugs as evil. It's actually mentioned in the 1961 International Convention on Drugs. They demonise users, they demonise dealers, demonise producers, demonise the drugs themselves in such a way that it makes it very difficult to then turn around and go, they're actually not that threatening, they aren't a menace, a scourge. the spawn of Satan. They are commodities which have psychoactive effects, which need to be controlled and regulated in the same way that alcohol, tobacco, and legal pharmaceuticals are. That's a difficult leap to make. So what we do is we provide people with the language, the messaging, in order to change that way of talking about drugs. And we change the political climate, so that a lot of the work that we've done has been with the press. So that whilst politicians have remained stum or actually been actively opposed to reform, what we've done is work very closely with columnists, with reporters, in such a way that you change the climate so that when politicians do step out on this thing, that they're not going to have their political careers ended by virtue of being taken apart by the media.
The current drugs regime has been in place for about 40 years, with very little change really, if anything. Maybe a bit of tinkering here and there, changing of categories of drugs, they go down, but fundamentally there's been no significant sign of things shifting. How do you see things panning out over the next, say, 5 or 10 years? Do you think that the time has come that there will be change quite soon?
I mean, the time has come is a great soundbite. We used to use it many, many years ago, I think, in order to attempt to lever some change in the climate. I feel a lot more comfortable with using that phrase now, quite literally, because I think the time has come. I think we're into what we call phase 2. We've spent a long time honing our arguments and developing an absolutely compelling case for the regulation of drugs and absolutely destroying any validity and credibility that prohibition has. And I think collectively with a number of other organisations around the world, we've done a brilliant job there. A lot of people now would find it very difficult to sustain a prohibitionist argument in public without being laughed at. So we've won the intellectual, political argument, if you like, or the policy argument. Now it's phase 2, and it's how do you, given that we are now in an end game, I think that we could be done and dusted in 10 years. How do we make sure that we retain that focus and make sure that the right people are getting behind the program at the right time? And this is where you've got to be really clever about identifying the particular audiences that we want to speak to in terms of influencing political change. And one of the things that's going on for us now is shifting the kind of people that we talk to from police officers, people in the health field, the harm reduction field, and drugs workers, to looking at issues of security, for instance. Given that security is something that governments run very hard on, create a lot of political attention around and resource threats to security around, and drugs are identified as a threat, we're now beginning to work with people in the security business, intelligence and military now, to challenge them in a way that means that they can feed into policy at a very, very high level and high level of diplomatic engagement. We think that, for instance, is one way of beginning to shift things. And I think it's now about getting very sophisticated and nuanced and not just pumping out the same messages again and again, but actually looking at what's the glue that holds prohibition together, and what are the levers that we can use to prise apart the armour that currently encases a very, very soft inside, which is, that's what we're doing now.
Thanks very much for your time, Danny.
No problem.